dear participants of this session. Let me warmly welcome you on behalf of the World Council of Churches, the United Evangelical Mission, and the Evangelical Church in Germany to this public panel on Christian perspectives on human dignity and human rights. I also would like to welcome you on behalf of my colleagues from the World Council of Churches, Peter Proof and Ute Hedrick, who were part of the organizing team. When the three organizations developed the idea to initiate a theological study process on human dignity and human rights in 2019, the Corona crisis and the Ukraine war in Europe had not become a reality. Both, in different ways, may have given even more reason to reflect and discuss on what common basis churches see their responsibility and take action to advocate for victims of human rights violations and strengthen multilateral institutions and international law as key instruments in that regard. The discussion today is taking place in a context of shrinking spaces of civil societies in many parts of the world, the rise of authoritarian regimes, populism, nationalism, and extremism. Hate and misinformation today is spread easily through social media. These developments take place on the background of growing economic disparities, which have marginalized great parts of the world's population. While there is no lack of knowledge about global challenges, I also would like to mention the climate change and the climate crisis, or the biodiversity issue. And although there is also no lack of knowledge on the human rights violations in different parts of this globe, it seems that the international institutions such as the United Nations and especially the international human rights system has been weakened in recent years and is more and more unable to respond to the present day's challenges in an appropriate way. This has been even more worrying on the background of the war in Ukraine and the crime committed in Bucha. During this conference, we have listened to a number of speakers who shared from a victim perspective on human rights violations in different parts of the world. And we have to acknowledge that there have been many Buchas where victims are desperately waiting for justice. What have Christians and churches to say in this regard? Is there a common basis on human dignity and human rights? We are glad that more than 50 church leaders, experts, and academicians followed our invitation and contributed from different regional, confessional, and theological perspectives on the topic of this conference. And we have gathered here in the recent days in hybrid form with representatives from more than 22 countries from all over the world. In this public session, we will have the opportunity to listen to some of the participants of this conference and to present the question at stake to the public. It is the intention of the organizers to publish all contributions together with a message coming from this conference prior to the assembly of the World Council of Churches, which will take place in August, September this year in Karlsruhe. We are extremely delighted that before the discussion will begin, we may listen to words of greetings from the Acting General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, Professor Ayan Sauka, the Chairperson of the Council of the Evangelical Church in Germany and President of the Evangelical Church of Westphalia, Dr. Annette Kurschus, and the General Secretary of the United Evangelical Mission, Reverend Volker Martin Dalli. I hand over that we move to these words of welcome and greetings.
Dear sisters and brothers, dear friends, welcome to this public session of the Conference on Christian Perspectives on Human Dignity and Human Rights. The World Council of Churches is pleased to partner with the United Evangelical Mission and the Evangelical Church of Germany in this important initiative, made even more important by the events taking place in the world these days. The focus of this public session is on human dignity and universal human rights, a common vision of churches for human rights and human rights advocacy today. In 2018, the World Council of Churches marked the 70th anniversary of its establishment in 1948. 1948 was also the year in which the foundational instrument of modern international human rights law, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, UDHR, was adopted. The fact that the WCC and the UDHR share the same birth year is at least in part due to the same search for unity, justice, peace, and human dignity after the horrors of the Second World War. As the WCC Central Committee observed in 2018 statement adopted for the 70th anniversary of the UDHR, the ecumenical movement, and I quote, made significant contributions to the articulation of the UDHR, in particular through the early work of the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs, CCIA, notably in the drafting of UDHR Article 18 on freedom of religion of belief. End the quotation. So it could be said that international human rights law is somehow part of the WCC's DNA. However, in the same statement, the Central Committee lamented the fact that in many parts of the world today, the legitimacy of the principles and obligations expressed in international human rights law are being undermined and attacked as never before. Accordingly, the Central Committee proposed a new process of ecumenical reflection and consultation on the relationship between international human rights law and scripture, theology, and Christian ethics. The present conference is part of the response to this proposal. Look at the state of our world today. The conflict in Ukraine, the persistence of racism, and the resurgence of forms of nationalism that marginalize, exclude, and demonize the other. This and many other things show that the discussion in which we are now engaged is central and urgent. It is clear that the universal respect for human rights that the UDHR was designed to promote has not been achieved. On the contrary, nations evidently hold very different perspectives on the validity of human rights or of international law in general. Instead, it is the principle of might makes right that now seems to predominate once again. Within the ecumenical movement too, churches from different traditions, regions, and cultures express different views on human rights, and specifically on the relationship between Christian faith principles and international human rights law. So, in this time of renewed conflict, confrontation, and division, in which the lives and dignity of so many people around the world are under increasing threat, it is of utmost importance that the ecumenical movement strive for unity of understanding and approach to the protection of the God-given dignity of every human being without discrimination. I pray that through this discussion, as we approach the 11th Assembly of the World Council of Churches in Karlsruhe later this year, we will become instruments of Christ's love, moving the world to reconciliation and unity.
Sisters and brothers, when people have found something to be proud of, and they can be very proud of human rights, there is always an argument about the legacy. Who came up with them in the first place? They belong to the Judeo-Christian heritage, say Christians. They stem from the idea of humankind being made in the likeness of God. Wrong, say the anti-religious people. They are our Enlightenment heritage and were implemented in spite of the churches. A few years ago, the sociologist Hans Joas disproved both those claims. He showed that they are both right, but also not right. He showed that the Enlightenment had a dark side. It did not agree that those it excluded from humanity in order to be able to colonize their land also had human rights. Human rights are, and they are also not, the legacy of the Bible. They are and are not the invention of the West. There is no linear progress. The idea of human rights was developed with Christianity and the Enlightenment against them, we could say. Human rights are rooted in both, but were also damaged by both. The struggle of slaves for liberation played a key role in the idea that every human being is holy and has rights solely through the fact of being human. Jesus tells of a woman who fought for her rights. The old Luther translation headed the story, "The Pleading Widow." Nothing could be further from the truth. This woman does not plead. She persists, she insists on her rights. You know the story from Luke 18 about the woman who goes to the judge and says, "Grant me justice." Many do not have this courage. They think, "I can't speak well, I don't know enough, I haven't got enough money." This woman is bold, so bold that she even dares to take her cause to a judge who has respect neither before God nor before human beings, so we hear. And I imagine a type of person like Donald Trump or Rodrigo Duterte or Jair Bolsonaro. How complacently arbitrary is the laconic biblical phrase, "For a while he refused." That is what often happens to human rights. They are smashed against authoritarian posturing. In countries like the Philippines, they clash with the rough displeasure of the rulers, or judges are replaced, as in Hungary, and those with integrity are replaced by others obedient to the government. There are many variations on rights being deprived of justice behind that dry phrase, "for a while he refused." Perhaps he had intentionally overlooked the widow. Perhaps he had denigrated her, as many refugees have experienced. Their use of the right to asylum has been declared to be misuse. Perhaps he dragged out his decision, as frequently happens. People wait for years for judgments, and some die in the waiting. How many weeks, how many months, how many years may have been contained in this phrase, "for a while he refused"? For those who need their rights to live, "for a while" is much too long. The success story of this woman is as simple as it is exhausting. She does not give up. She persists. She doesn't let go. It is almost amusing to see how, with time, this woman swells up into a fury in the imagination of the judge. And you don't have to be a psychologist to see through him. He only wants to get rid of this complaining, bothersome person. And so he finally says, though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming. Bother me, wear me out, keep coming. That is the widow's clout. That is the strategy of the ordinary people and the movements that advocate for important rights, human rights. Keep coming and insisting. That was what the movement Buy No Fruit from South Africa did. The Madres de Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, and the women of Maria 2.0. That is like the small beginnings of Pro Asyl and the Fridays for Future movement that started with a schoolgirl who, instead of going to school on Fridays, sat in front the Royal Palace in Stockholm with a homemade poster. There are things that we cannot leave up to grace and favor. The protection of dignity and life, for example, daily bread and freedom of expression, everything that human rights guarantee for a person just because they are human. Jürgen Habermas calls human rights a realistic utopia. For them to become hands-on reality, they need people like this widow, people who fight for them, even where it seems impossible. May God bless this conference, though that its inspiration falls on fertile ground, and likewise the Assembly of the World Council of Churches in Karlsruhe this August and September, sustainably empowering its work in standing up for human dignity and human rights in the years to come.
Honorable participants and guests of the Conference on Christian Perspectives on Human Dignity and Human Rights, dear sisters and brothers. As General Secretary of the United Evangelical Mission, a communion of 38 churches in Africa, Asia, and Europe, and the Bodelschwing Foundation, I would like to extend my warmest greetings to you on the occasion of this international ecumenical meeting organized by the World Council of Churches, the Evangelical Church of Germany, and the United Evangelical Mission. I'm delighted that so many committed theologians from different regions and denominations have come together in Wuppertal, as well as digitally from all over the world, from other countries and continents, to share and discuss what contribution and commitment Christians from around the world can and shall make to ensure that human dignity and human rights of all people are effectively protected and defended. What you are doing now has a long tradition in Christian faith, even before that in the tradition of the Hebrew Bible. Allow me to quote a word which I choose for the baptism of my firstborn daughter from Psalm 40, the verses 9 and 10. I have proclaimed the good news of righteousness in the great assembly. Indeed, I do not restrain my lips, O Lord. You yourself know. I have not hidden your righteousness within my heart. I have declared your faithfulness and your salvation. I have not concealed your loving kindness and your truth from the great assembly. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in 1948 after a terrible war in which more than 60 million people died, in addition to the 8 million of mass murders in the extermination camps of the Germans. The consensus of the Declaration of Human Rights, which obliges states to protect and guarantee the rights of their citizens, seem to have become fragile in recent years. But it is not and shall never be negotiable. The same seems to be the case for the obligation of states laid down in the Charter of the United Nations in 1945 to respect international law in order to ensure peace, security, and justice for all nations and people. The terrible war in Ukraine has brought to us the urgency of the issues on which many of the participants of this conference have written papers from the perspective of Christians around the world. It is war again in Europe. Terrible. Unbelievable that after so many cruel war experiences, there are wars again and again. The fact that there were and are wars in so many regions of the world fades into the background at the moment even more than it already happens otherwise. A quick look at the list kept at Wikipedia for the 21st century alone names 41 wars and warlike conflicts with thousands and thousands of victims, yes, with millions. There have been at least 60 to 65 million deaths from wars worldwide since the end of World War II. Psalm 40 says, I have not hidden your faithfulness and your righteousness within my heart. I have declared your faithfulness and your salvation. I have not concealed your loving kindness and your truth from the great assembly. The liberation of God's people from slavery in Egypt was followed by the gift of the commandments to live in freedom, to live with justice. And justice is based on the well-being of the weak. Kings, rulers, and governors are not above the law, but are measured by the fact that it is not the law of the strongest that applies, but that all come to their right. That has led God to send Amos, who preached, take away from me the noise of your songs, for I will not hear the melody of your stringed instruments, but let justice run down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. In that situation, the cultic activity is so disgusting to God that he closes his eyes and ears against it because it offends his senses. He cannot longer watch and listen to it. Indeed, he can no longer smell the sacrificial ceremonies because they disgust him. This we also have to apply to our own strategies, to conferences we make, to international ones, to general assemblies like the WCC and the General Assembly of UEM will have. What are the consequences of our conferences? God lets Amos speak so drastically, probably because the people thought to be able to escape the social duties by great cultic performance, to pay them off by their sacrifices. Amos does not primarily criticize the celebration of worship, but the flight of people from social and human obligations and the false self-assurance into which they have fallen. In the face of the skyscraping social injustice, God withdraws from all religious attempts at reconciliation that do not get on the root of the evil. God does not want a bombastic cult, but justice. That's what it all boils down to. Let justice flow like waters and righteousness like never-ending stream. Dear friends, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 expresses also the fact that it is not the law of the strongest that should apply, but that the dignity and rights of all people should be protected and that governments must base their actions on this obligation. Human rights do not create heaven on earth, but for us Christians, like the commandments, they are protective fences of law which contain injustice and protect against uncertainty. Those who violate and trample on human rights will have to answer for it. This is the hope of the many victims of injustice and violence expressed in the biblical traditions and expressed today in our societies. In United Evangelical Mission, we maintain close ecumenical relationships with churches in the fellowship of the UEM and beyond. We know from our members in the Philippines, in West Papua, in Indonesia, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Sri Lanka, and in many other places about the suffering, violence, and injustice they have to endure where human rights are trampled. As Christians all over the world, we see ourselves obliged by our faith, but also by our history, to stand up for human rights and solidarity. Wherever those rights are violated, we raise our voices like the psalmist said, I have proclaimed the good news of righteousness in the great assembly. Indeed, I do not restrain my lips. Dear sisters and brothers, indeed, as a Christian, I cannot be silent. Or as Martin Luther once translated, I will not have my mouth shut. I express my sincere gratitude to you for setting out at this meeting to share different confessional and regional perspectives on human dignity and human rights, and to develop and strengthen common convictions and recommendations for the Church's contribution to the protection of human rights. Please keep on speaking up and proclaiming economic and social justice. Keep on fighting for human rights and dignity. May God bless you and the results of this conference. Thank you.
Let me express my sincere thanks and appreciation for the 3 words of greetings, which have not only brought further reflection to our discussion, but also have been an encouragement to the work and the coming discussion we are now moving forward to. Before starting the discussion and introducing the 7 speakers, let me just share with you that we have an advocate of the audience, Ivas Kuspis, media communication stuff from the World Council of Churches. He later will come in and share possible responses, questions, or whatever. And we will come back to him after the discussion has started. Now, let me introduce to you the speaker. I will do that one after the other so that we immediately move after the first introduction into the question. The first speaker on this panel is Mr. Peter Proof. Peter Proof became director of the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs at the World Council of Churches in February 2014 and has responsibility for the World Council of Churches programs in the field of peace building, disarmament, and human rights. Peter Proof, by profession, is a lawyer. Peter, you have worked for many decades, even before you took responsibility in the World Council of Churches in the field of international law and human rights, now as director of the Commission on International Affairs. Could you share about your experiences on the meaning of international human rights system at the UN and why it is important whether churches are engaged in the debate around human rights? In other words, why do we need this conference on Christian perspectives on human dignity and human rights today?
Thank you very much. Let me first take this opportunity to thank you, Jochen, and you, Uta, for our partnership in this process, in this conference, and in the work that we're seeking to pursue thereafter. I also just want to underline as a little housekeeping issue that for those of you who would like to make comments or propose or put questions, do so in the chat functions, whether you're in the Zoom platform or watching on the YouTube live stream, so that our colleague Ivars can monitor and pick these questions up and bring them back to the table. To your question, Jochen, international human rights law is an essential foundation for accountability for human rights violations, on this earth at least. It is a sine qua non, in fact, for such accountability. But legal frameworks do not implement themselves. Processes and forums are required for that purpose. At the international level, a complex system of UN human rights forums and processes have been created, encompassing the UN Human Rights Council, the Universal Periodic Review Mechanism, the array of special procedures mandated by the Human Rights Council, and the human rights treaty bodies created under the different human rights treaties and conventions, among others. The substance on which these forums and processes operate are reports or testimonies of human rights violations. The claim of the widow, the reiterated claim of the widow, in fact. But one of the most important sources of such reports and testimonies are the non-governmental organizations that relate to the UN system, including many churches and church-related organizations. Together with other faith communities, churches often have the best access to and experience of the lived realities of people at the local level, including the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, and the most at risk of violation of their human dignity and rights. For this reason, among many others, it is of special importance that churches and faith communities bring to the attention of the relevant international forums and processes the situations of which they, the churches, are aware, in which violations have taken place that might not otherwise receive any attention, especially in situations where access to justice locally or nationally is not available. Of course, the WCC, through its Commission of the Churches on International Affairs, has played an important historical role already in the drafting of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights itself, as we had heard in some of the opening remarks. Currently, The work of the WCC in this area is especially focused on encouraging member churches and partners to take up this responsibility and to help guide them in accessing the most appropriate and effective mechanism in the midst of this complex array of options. Beyond that, in a context in which the institutional architecture of international human rights accountability is increasingly attacked and undermined, it is important that churches not only engage with, but support these processes, without which many vulnerable and marginalized individuals and communities are left without recourse, often at the mercy of uncaring or even actively oppressive authorities, or subject to the tyranny of the majority. But all of this presupposes that churches recognize international human rights law and its related mechanisms as consistent with the faith and ethical values to which they subscribe, and as relevant tools for the promotion and protection of God-given human dignity. And the concern of this conference is especially addressing, is the quality of that relationship between Christian faith and ethical principles on the one hand, and international human rights law on the other, from the vast range of theological, regional, and cultural perspectives within the ecumenical movement. Recognizing that there seems, in many cases, to be an increasing divergence of opinions on this matter among the members of the ecumenical movement, concurrent with a resurgence of tensions, hatreds, discrimination, populist nationalisms, and conflict in the wider world, there is evidently a critical need for an open and frank discussion and reflection among us. And that is why we are here.
Thanks, Peter, for introducing us from World Council of Churches perspective to the issue of churches and human rights. And I just move over to a second expert, Dr. Matthews George Shunakara. Dr. Shunakara is a former director of the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs of the World Council of Churches from 2009 to 2014. And he currently serves as the General Secretary of the Christian Conference of Asia. Matthews, you have worked as a director of the Commission, and now you are the General Secretary of CCA. In your contribution for this conference, you had outlined the numerous activities of the World Council of Churches being implemented in the years and even decades till today. And please, I would like to ask you share how you value this engagement and comment on present challenges for churches advocating for human rights from international, but also as well as from an Asian perspective.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Mote. I consider it as a great privilege to share some of my thoughts with regard to your questions about the experiences, past experiences, and also the church's experiences. Well, my successor, the current CCA director, started with WCC's involvement in the area of freedom of religion, where especially the drafting of Article 18 of the UDHR by the first director of CCA. Well, if we take the past experiences of the churches across the world, starting from 1948, ever since WCC was officially founded, there were a number of engagements by the churches or through the World Council of Churches facilitation. Churches across the globe they were directly and indirectly involved in number of human rights issues or addressing human rights issues, and they were directly engaged in human rights advocacy at various levels, at the national level, regional level, and also at the international level. But the fact is that in spite of all those developments of various mechanisms and the instruments to protect human rights, always the church has also found the fact that the world is not really free from human rights violations. And even religious leaders or the church leaders, they have been facing such kind of a vulnerable situations in different parts of the world in the Asian context. I can quote a number of examples, especially even from these days. What is happening in the context of Philippines or Myanmar or Pakistan and West Papua, or in some of the African countries and some of the Latin American countries. So it is actually generally perceived and accepted the fact that there is a growing understanding on human rights, and the need for effective ways of human rights advocacy is need of the hour. But the churches and their capacities, that also varies from place to place or from continent to continent or country to country. So the instrumental importance of human rights principles such as equality, participation, then accountability, and the rule of law, although all these facts are widely accepted, the churches are living and working in the midst of the reality that where all these rights are negated. So the question of universality of human rights, that is questioned more often by duty bearers, state or non-state actors, than the right holders. There the churches also are actually those who are entitled for these human rights. They are also the victims. It is in this context that what would be, we need to articulate that what would be the vision of the churches needed for upholding human dignity, for protecting human rights. See, the churches in this context cannot be mere spectators, but they need to be committed to promote and implement human rights standards that are essential to demand an awareness of the universality or the essential values and aspirations that are embodied in the human rights principles and commitment. It is actually very much needed. The churches need to be attacked. When we know the fact that when the attack on the universal rights remain the main barrier to human rights implementation in many contexts. So what the world now needs is a systematic approach in universal implementation. For that kind of a record implementation, awareness, and also advocacy at various levels, when it is needed, of course, churches also can play an important role in different contexts. One thing is very clear that despite all fervent commitments and normative advances, we are still lacking serious implementation mechanism. These are the gaps that exist in various forms. It is a reality. For example, impunity, then armed conflict, discrimination, and authoritarian rule, all these things became serious threats to human rights and human dignity. The churches are actually in the midst of it. Number of churches, starting from the very beginning of the World Council of Churches engagement in the area of human rights, and even until now, that many churches across the world, they are directly involved in their struggle against the human rights violations. So it is also a matter of serious concern that how the struggles for human rights are branded or labeled as subversive activities in the name of a security agenda introduced or imposed by government. This is what is exactly happening these days in the context in the Philippines, where people are simply branded as communists or subversive, their engagement in subversive activities that is portrayed. As a result of that, even church workers are persecuted and they live in a vulnerable situation. Well, based on my experiences in dealing with churches around the world through WCC as well as in the Asia region through CCA, I would like to point out that any comprehensive strategy to promote the universal implementation of human rights standards and advocacy on human rights, that should include a proper human rights education components. Why I am telling this? By way of nurturing values of upholding human rights and human dignity and reinforcing attitudes and aptitudes, then the contextual human rights education should be a priority of the churches based on their biblical theological values and understanding. So this is indeed a need of the hour. This is mainly to underscore the common task of actualizing human rights in every situation and in every community. So then only such kind of human rights education and training that will be initiated will help the rights holders to identify and also to address their needs, and that will help them to seek a solution consistent with the international human rights standard, for which the churches and the ecumenical movement have key roles to play. This is what I remember. I suggest. I remember one thing, that a series of consultations and study conferences were organized by the CCA and WCC, the post-Porto Alegre Assembly period starting from 2007 onwards, with the focus on towards an ecumenical agenda for advocacy on human rights and advocacy and peace and security and human rights. Global consultations were organized in Geneva in 2000, and another one was organized in 2008 in Bose. Then regional consultations were held in Bangkok for Asia, then Sierra Leone, once for Africa, and another second one in Rwanda, for Africa region, then in Guatemala in the Latin American region. So those were, I would say, that the most prominent and effective training programs enable the churches from our experiences in human rights advocacy in the respective regions at that time. The need is now to revitalize such efforts to equip the churches with new mandates and through new initiatives. So if we believe that human rights should not remain as a mere idealistic desire or just a mere ambition, then we must value the importance of the universal implementation of human rights for the best interest of protecting the rights of everyone based on our Christian faith and witness values. What we witness today is the growing trend of, we know that the state-sponsored repression and hardships imposed on people who are concerned on human rights and human dignity, and people, those who are forced to abandon their homes and they are escaping from their own ancestral land. All these things are happening, as we know that this leads to depletion of talents and also resources, both human and social capital. So should this not be a priority of the churches to address these concerns and to be engaged in advocacy on some of these issues? So every day, what we see now, the refugees fleeing war and devastation, this can even destabilize not only the countries, their own countries, at the same time, neighboring countries. So where are we standing when we need to address some of these issues, when persons are internally displaced and the entire communities and their livelihood are destroyed and they lost? So when such situations lead to negation of respect for their dignity and rights, the purpose of their existence as human beings and to protect their dignity and their peace and security, when that is undermined and threatened, the churches have a key role to play. The churches did that, the ecumenical movement did that role in the past. So the churches should have a vision to address these problems that undermine the dignity and inalienable rights of people, hence defaming the image of God. So there are a number of issues the churches need to address in different contexts and different continents these days. The climate-related challenges we know, and also the refugee crisis we know. So a human right approach is the most essential aspects when we look at the rights and dignity of people whose lives are mostly adversely affected in most of these contexts. So coming to my last point, number of other issues like the migration, especially the rights of the migrants, then migrant workers, then the stateless persons and the refugees and the internally displaced people. These are the major human rights challenges that the churches and the ecumenical movement addressed in the past, which is still, these areas still require advocacy with an integrated approach in which churches need to take keen interest as part of their faith and also as part of their witness. Well, churches across the world must also spare no effort to combat the growing human trafficking issue. And this is a phenomenon that is often
Dr. Shunakarak, just I look at the
So,
time a bit that the others get, if you could.
well, I will conclude that here, having said all these things, that I would say that the churches and the global ecumenical movements in the global north also should have a clear vision and a concrete plan of action to accompany the churches in the global south to be, in order to be in solidarity with them at the time of their vulnerable situations. And this should be, in that way, they should be enabled to be engaged in a more meaningful way in the human rights advocacy. This is what I can tell from our experiences in the past, and also considering the present realities, whatever we are experiencing these days. This is what I can add at this stage. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dr. Shunakara, for outlining quite a broad agenda, the WCC, and of course, in correlation, member churches have to take or should take up in future. And we will see and discuss in what way we might even move towards this direction also throughout this conference. I know now would like to move to the next speaker from a different perspective, not from the institutional perspective, also from inside the World Council of Churches, but to a perspective from an Orthodox perspective, but also from a different, I would say, also age and gender perspective. I would like to introduce Natalia Vasilevich. Natalia Vasilevich is an Orthodox theologian, a political scientist, a human rights lawyer from Minsk, director of Center Ecumena, and moderator of Working Group of Coordination Council for Belarus Christian Vision. Currently, Natalia Vasilevich resides in Bonn, where she writes her dissertation on mission of the Church in today's world in early pre-conciliar process of the Holy and Great Council. Natalia, you are a theologian from the Orthodox Church with this special focus on ethics. You are from Belarus and today you are based in Germany. As we know, in some churches, the notion of human rights is quite controversial. How do you observe theological reflection on human rights within the Orthodox churches today?
Indeed, there are controversies in the Orthodox approaches to human rights, and we shall know that theology matters and theology brings fruit, and how we address the issue of human rights and which fruits are borne by our theological concepts allows us to understand and to judge our own theological tradition. And I would like first to start with a realistic approach and come to a Catholic believer from Belarus, Volga Zolotar. Volga Zolotar was arrested 18th March 2021, and during interrogations, she was subjected to violence and torture. Her lawyer testified that he had personally witnessed the signs of torture on the woman's body. And following the allegation of torture, the lawyer's license was annulled. Olga Zolotar spoke in the court in her final speech on the 3rd December 2021. And I quote, "I am here because I am a caring person. I am here because I live by God's commandments. I am here because I am a mom who wants to protect her children. As a mother and Catholic, I stand guard over human dignity and spiritual values. All my actions and statements are determined by love towards people and by hatred towards lies and violence." Volga, and the name in Belarusian language, Vola means freedom or liberty. So Vola was sentenced for 4 years in prison for her human rights activities and trying to be Christian. She is Catholic. She is mother of 5 children. I'm Orthodox. I do not have children. She is not theologian. I am theologian. But we together struggle for human rights. And it doesn't matter if we have different differences in us. But what unites us is this respect to human dignity. And that's why I think that for Orthodox theology, and there are many theologians who talks about this, that we should be realistic and we should relate to reality. And theology, it's not an abstract concept. So we should not theorize an abstract way about human dignity or human personality. All theories do not have any sense when real violations of human rights happen. What matters and really matters, and what really shows the value of our theology and the essence of our theology is how do we address a certain situation, how do we apply our understanding of human dignity? How is it possible that the same Orthodox tradition, the same Orthodox Church gives example of religious leader Archbishop Iakovos in the United States of America, who is marching in the March of Selma together with Martin Luther King. And in the same time, it gives Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, who stands for war against his own flock in Ukraine, who does not come to any march to protect his own flock who is dying, who is tortured now in Ukraine, in Bucha, in Kharkiv, and who are bombed. How is it possible that he does not hear the voice of his own bishops in Ukrainian church, Metropolitan Onufriy, does not respond to it, does not hear this voice and this request for human rights? So do we need to speak about great theological concepts when in the practice, in the practical life, it does this kind of, so differentiation comes not so much from theological concepts, it comes to in the practical application of human rights, and I think that it's human rights is a very critical analytical tool for us as a churches to look at ourselves and to judge ourselves, and if we make failures, to repent. And I think that it's very important not only to promote human rights, but also to use human rights as a this analytical tool for ourselves. And I think that ecumenical, there is an ecumenical and universal responsibility to ensure that this process happens, and to ensure that we really not just theorize on certain things, but we come to concrete situations, and in concrete situations we try to make changes. As for example, Olga Zolotar, who is, by the way, she's not even human rights activist. She's just a mother of 5 children, but who was motivated by her Christian faith to stand up against tyranny. And I want to quote very interesting. Last Saturday, when we started our conference in the Orthodox churches, it was a day of when we venerate Mother of God. And when we speak about Mother of God, sometimes it's often she's represented in a very feminine way. Yes, and but in this catechesis, we also see her as a deposer of inhuman tyranny from his rule. So this image of the Mother of God in Orthodoxy, I think, is also very important. And the Volga Zolotar, I think, has the same capacity as a mother of children. She's not a religious leader. She's not a human rights activist, but still just understanding and feeling this motivation for human rights coming from Christian faith and motivated by Christian faith, make her to one day to depose the tyrann from his rule.
Thank you, Natalia, to not only introduce us to the discussion in the context you mentioned, but also to relate theology to practice and to action on the ground. Let us move further to Reverend Dr. Kenneth Mtata. Dr. Mtata is an educator, a religious leader from Zimbabwe, and current General Secretary of the Zimbabwe Council of Churches. He teaches biblical studies, hermeneutics, biblical languages, and contextual theology at undergraduate and postgraduate programs in South Africa and in Germany. Kenneth, as church representative from a Southern African context, how do you view the meaning of human rights from church perspective, looking back to the anti-apartheid struggle till today, when the need to combat racism and discrimination is still so relevant in the present context? In addition, let me also raise a question: how do you view the meaning of human rights on the background of the past colonial history in Zimbabwe and in other African countries?
Thank you very much. As we were preparing to come for this conference, just some 2 days before we came here, a story struck me of a 43-year-old young man from Zimbabwe by the name of Elvis Nyati, a father of 4 kids, who was set alight in Deep Slot Township of South Africa on the 6th of April, in the night when poor South Africans from the township were protesting poor policing of immigration laws. The mob could burn someone in a way that recalls what used to happen during apartheid days. The story of Elvis did not get the same international press coverage because the world was focused on what was happening in Ukraine. The situation in Ukraine, characterized by the killing of civilians in cold blood by the Russian soldiers, including the raping of women, was a shock and remains a shock to the Western world when they recall the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was actually a major breakthrough as a shared global vision for the recognition, protection, promotion, and dignity of every person everywhere in the world. Yet, from the beginning of this vision of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it was characterized by inherent contradictions. Because as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being signed at the United Nations General Assembly in Paris on the 10th of December, 1948. Many African countries were still under colonial and empire control. And the Western countries were making a commitment to such an ideal vision. As we read the story of Elvis and his killing, we cannot forget the context of 1948 in Southern Africa. In 1948 was a turning point in South Africa and by extension to the whole region of Southern Africa. An election was being held in South Africa in which the majority people of color were disqualified from voting. And the National Party, led by the Dutch Reformed cleric, D.F. Malan, and his coalition partner, the Afrikaner Party, took advantage of the fear among white South Africans of the aspirations of Black people towards self-rule as a basis of campaigning for a white supremacist government. They promised the institutionalization of a racial segregation or separate development or apartheid government, as it was called. This was the beginning of racism as an ideological, a theological, a policy, and a practice whose legacy in South Africa and by extension, the rest of the region in Southern Africa had a bearing on the death of this young man some few days ago. There is no way one can read the story of this brutal killing without connecting it to this history of racism. It is this background of the infrastructure of a segregated population through which we must read the case of the death of this young man. The apartheid and racial segregation history in Southern Africa created deep economic inequalities, as well as deep sense of self-unworthiness. This self-unworthiness can now be projected on the foreigners who are seen to be threatening the economic opportunities of poor South Africans. The reason why Elvis is not in his home country cannot be disconnected from the history of economic marginalization, the infrastructure which was established by the Rhodesians who benefited from the economic marginalization of Black people in Rhodesia and today Zimbabwe. The infrastructure of violence that was put in place that time, which has continued in the post-colonial situation in Zimbabwe and in many countries in the region, can be directly connected to this racial segregation basis. The church has not lost focus on the vision towards human rights and beyond the effects of colonialism. During this conference, I identified 5 issues that I think the churches in Southern Africa and indeed in the world seem to be appropriating from the vision of human rights. The first is that we are realizing that the church needs to reclaim the language of human rights in a way that is accessible to the church, to allow the church to use this language to talk about human rights within the church and in society. For me, this is an important process that is ongoing and that we can see happening if we are going to protect people from further effects of this history of racism. Secondly, I can also see a sense of recovering processes of reflections of the idea of the dignity of the human person. As I was reading the statement of the South African Council of Churches yesterday, one of the issues they raised was we need to reclaim the idea of Ubuntu being human within the African context. It is this rediscovery that will make it fearful for for South Africans to see that they cannot spill the blood of a fellow African. During this conference, I also realized sometimes when we are looking at the history and the effects of racial segregation in the context of Southern Africa, we may miss the suffering and the challenges that other Christians all over the world are struggling with racial challenges. So third, what we may need is to establish ongoing conversations and networks among human rights defenders to promote local and intercontextual systems of solidarity. The reason is that all those who are fighting against human rights and human dignity are also building networks across the world. Number four, we also realize that there is a need for us to build and promote infrastructures of accountability within the church, but also in secular society. We are realizing that as a result of hypocrisy at international level, the infrastructures for accountability on human rights has slowly become eroded. Many Africans right now, as war is taking place in Ukraine, many Africans can identify with what Russia is doing. Because when Libya was being bombed, we did not get the same outrage. When Iraq was being invaded, we did not get the same outrage. So there is a sense that there is a hypocritical approach to the standards of human rights for which the world need to change. And indeed, for many people, as they read this, they see this as a racist approach to the human rights system from which the world needs to recover. If I take these learnings from this conference, I see that we can still reclaim the hope and the vision of a just, peaceful, and abundant life that is drawn from the system of the human rights agenda that was codified in 1948, but whose history and whose spirit goes back to our own scriptures and our theology as a church. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kenneth, also giving us from a regional perspective some questions and explainings of some of the obstacles also to embrace the human rights and to promote it in a constructive and in a way that churches can be part of it in future. Let me move to the next speaker, Reverend Ute Hedrich. Ute Hedrich is a senior church counselor in the Evangelical Church in Germany. She has worked in the regional church office for mission, ecumenism, and church world responsibility of the Evangelical Church in Westphalia. You have also been for many years a co-worker in UEM in Namibia, and you have lived in Zimbabwe as well. And now you are responsible as desk officer for the Middle and Far East, Australia and Pacific. Ute, you today are here as representative from EKD, which is one of the hosting organizations. But beside what I shared, I know that for a long time you worked on the gender justice issue in ecumenical context. And also this has been for many decades a very controversial issue within church and within society. From your perspective, how in your view international human rights in the past, but also today, are relevant for Christian perspectives on human dignity and human rights and vice versa.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jochen, to you and to everyone that I can be here. And when you put the topic, international human rights and gender justice in church and society, I said, why don't you put question marks there? And he has not changed it, but okay, question marks one cannot read. So, but I would put some question marks there. And I just said I have learned here one thing in the conference. We learned that only very late the human rights debate were diversified, that women's rights were also specially discussed. It was in the beginning, 48, we heard it just now from Kenneth and others, not so much clearly a topic, like many other things also not. We had the feminist movement starting in the 60s and 70s, but in the church we didn't hear so much, honestly. But maybe also not so much also in society here and there. 1995, we had the 4th World Conference on Women in Beijing. And I think for many of us who are a little bit older, women here, it was the turning point that gender became a topic on the agenda, was a milestone for understanding it. But again, it was also taking some time that it came on the agenda, also in the human rights discussion. But one very specific landmark was then the Security Council adopted the resolution 1325 on women, peace and security on Reformation Day, quite interesting, Reformation Day 2000. This resolution, and here I quote a little bit, affirms the important role of women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts, peace negotiations, peace building, peacekeeping, humanitarian response in post-conflict reconstruction, and stresses the importance of equal participation and full involvement in all efforts for the maintenance and the promotion of peace and security. This resolution 1325 urges a participation of women in all peacekeeping processes, as well also that one really checks who is mainly affected by violence, that it's really that one has a clearer look to it. In short, one can say no women, no peace, isn't it? And how many women, we could ask then, have been really directly involved in peace negotiations? We see them now on TV. In the Ukraine, I haven't seen many women or at all women. I'm not sure. So maybe I don't watch the right TV channels. Who are sitting around the table? Who are doing the network, maybe behind women? Sexual violence as a means of war is sometimes mentioned, but often also not clearly reported and seen. So therefore, it's a question on the table, and now some women started, and especially in Canada, in Sweden, and also in our foreign ministry, they are talking now about a feminist foreign policies we have to have. And I quote now Annalena Baerbock, if half of the population is not equally involved, respected, or paid, democracies are not perfect. Now, how can we talk about democracy if women are not involved? It's a quote from Auswärtiges Amt. Let me quote Christine Lagarde from a business sector, but I think we can turn it around. It's not only business. Women tend to have a more inclusive leadership style than their male counterparts. A recent study showed that female leaders were often more effective during the pandemic, performed better under pressure, and rated more positively on most of the competences involving interpersonal skills. It is exactly those skills that are needed to rebuild our economics, she said as an economic, in a more equitable and inclusive way. And I would say it's not only economics, it also is everything. It's social politics everywhere. Therefore, I think we have to ask the question, is equal participation there when we talk about human rights? Do we have to check not only always, and I'm not more for this, that we always have to count how women are participating, but it's an issue, women and a diverse society reflected in processes for peacekeeping, for discussions on human dignity and human rights. So therefore, I think we have to include women, we have to include LGBTIQ+, we have to think about a diversification. We discuss nowadays also how people with disabilities are visible in processes and they have to say something. When we do that, it's not only who is sitting around the table, but also who gets the money. Yeah, it's sometimes we women are not talking so much about money, but sometimes we should do, because we have to have, and we discussed it a lot, and the General Secretary is sitting here about gender budgeting. Yeah, this is not only needed in UEM, that's also needed in municipalities, in states, in government, everywhere. I think we have to have a look who is getting what and how much. And this is also needed, and this is a human right that everyone should also get something of that what is there. And then we have to look what kind of stories are told and who gets prizes, I would say. What kind of stories are told? I just mentioned, and we had now the General Secretary from the Asian Council of Churches here, and I didn't hear something about China. I will mention now one of the recent discussions which we have in China, the oppression of the Muslim Uyghur, I don't know if you pronounce it in English like that, minority. And if we look there with a gender perspective, and we see now the first reports on that, it's there. Of course, we have these re-education camps, which are under terrible conditions, and we saw a few things of BBC and BBC TV, but there is also something which is happening to women. There is a forced sterilization of women there. Women are subjected to rape. It is terrible, especially terrible for women. Only a few came out, could tell the stories. We don't have numbers, and we only have also little stories. So which stories are we telling? Who is winning the prizes? I was reading another story. I just give examples because we women are talking about examples and stories which have to be heard. In Congo, we have a lady who is a colonial there, and her name is Muyolo Sidikuya Honori. She is a policewoman, and she was fighting for human rights there and persecuting people who were raping women. And she was telling this story, and she was taking that up, and this was one of the important things. And she was working together with the one who won the Nobel Peace Prize, Dr. Mukwege, but he won the prize, and but she's doing the work. She's not asking for the prize at all. So at the end, I just want to say we are talking about stories. We are talking about people. We have to talk also about gender justice in the church. We have churches who are not yet ordaining women and so on. We know all these stories, but what I want to make sure is that if we talk about human rights, we should know no women, no peace, no human rights without participation of half of the population. We need equal representation of women. And we need women not only to make the picture nicer, to cheer it up, not only because of the percentage, but women can contribute a lot. We as women are not playing sometimes the same style, the same games, have the same rules like men, but we offer a diverse, another impact to questions which are on the table. And since it's Easter soon, we should not forget that what we have, if there would have been not the women, the story of life would have been not told. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Ute, to bring in this gender perspective and gender justice perspective, which of course is a quite important one. You mentioned UEM on the gender budgeting in the municipality, so I guess the EKD has it already implemented. But let's share maybe later on this, and let's move now to The next speaker, Reverend Dr. Nicolas Kazarian. He is an Orthodox theologian born in France. He has taught ecumenical relations at the Catholic University of Paris and the Institute of Orthodox Theology, Saint-Serge. He is the parish priest of a Greek Orthodox congregation in Manhattan and serves as ecumenical officer and director of the Department on Inter-Orthodox, Ecumenical and Interfaith Relations. Nicolas, you are a clergy of the Greek Orthodox Church. At the same time, you are an expert on geopolitics and religion. Being part of a conference on Christian perspectives on human dignity and human rights, what from your perspective churches as faith-based actors should or could contribute to prevent a further deterioration of the international order and the international human rights system?
Thank you everybody for this beautiful conference. Greetings from New York, and allow me to convey the greetings, salutations from His Eminence Archbishop Elpidio IV of America, who wishes a success to this conference. As you all know, religions are geopolitical realities, not only as they are connected with the life of certain states, but because of their presence on the ground as grassroots actors. And each faith-based organization has its own vision about how to explore its presence on the ground. And they participate in the power dynamics that are structuring today's global scene. However, human rights are not an adjustment variable that depends on the status of one specific faith-based organization, religion, churches, either as part of the majority community of one's nation or a minority status. That's why what I would like to share with you today is really about how this presence of faith and the action of faith when it comes to geopolitics, international relations, also structure the international relations in which we live in the perspective of the Orthodox Church. As you know, the Orthodox Church insists on the fact that humans are relational beings, an image of God's communion in which we can deepen the reality of coexistence, dialogue, and freedom. And when it will come to tackling one specific aspect of geopolitics and human rights, I will develop and unpack what it means when it comes to religious freedom itself. So the recent document endorsed by the Ecumenical Patriarchate entitled "For the Life of the World Toward the Social Ethos of the Orthodox Church" that was published in 2020 insists on the connection between freedom and our quest of God's communion. I quote the document now. It is the realization of one's nature in its own power, proper good end, one's ability to flourish in the full range of one's humanity, which for the human person entails freely seeking union with God. So human rights are a legal reality that was said several times today, expressing principles such as individual freedom, equality for all without exception, and human dignity. From these principles result more specific rights, like freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to private property, the right to safety. More specific definitions organize the life of the city through economic, social, and political rights. While Orthodoxy embraces the principle of human rights, it sees many limitations in the way they are disconnected from faith and religion. The lack of commitment to the universality of human rights. And one speaker earlier during the conference mentioned the universal implementation of human rights. I think it's crucial here to really understand that the paradoxical situation in which faith-based organization and churches are being really exposed to their relationship with human rights. Once again, I would like to quote the document I just mentioned for the life of the world that says, the language of human rights may not say all that can and should be said about the profound dignity and glory of creatures fashioned after the image and likeness of God, but it is a language that honors that reality in a way that permits international and interfaith cooperation in the work of civil rights and civil justice, and that therefore says much that should be said. The Orthodox Church therefore lends its voice to the call to protect and advance human rights everywhere and to recognize those rights as both fundamental to and inalienable from every single human life, end of quote. Because even in the acceptance of individual liberties as a space, small as it may be, of human free will, the implementation of the law opposes our monstrous selfishness and allows us to become beings of communion and relationship. When these rights are denied, the quest for equal rights remains crucial. When they are granted, a spiritual quest becomes necessary to avoid the danger of individualism and to create circumstances in which it is possible to reveal the image of God by being fully human. Now the question of religious freedom. The Holy and Great Council of Crete in 2016 stated, I quote, "A fundamental human right is the protection of the principle of religious freedom in all its aspects, namely the freedom of conscience, belief, and religion, including alone and in community, in private and in public, the right to freedom of worship and practice, the right of to manifest one's religion, as well as the right of religious communities to religious education and to the full function and exercise of their religious duties without any form of direct or indirect interference by the state. The struggle for religious freedom and the respect for the conscience of every human being should be proof of the triumph of love over hatred, of unity over division, and of compassion over the numbing sensation of indifference that is rooted in contemporary materialism. True freedom of conscience is based on the conviction that our relationship with the other is not separate from, but integrally related to our relationship with ourselves. After all, the words of St. Paul, we are all members of one body. In closing, in countries and cultures where there are dominant viewpoints, faith traditions, and political and economic instruments, the rights of the majority can only be truly and justly secured by guaranteeing the full human and religious rights to all minorities. That's how the geopolitical aspect kicks in. This is why the ecumenical patriarchate tirelessly seeks to promote the rights of all peoples and faith, both in Turkey, but throughout the world, for the measure with which we treat and honor others is the measure with which we can also expect to be recognized and respected. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Nicolas Kazarian, to bring us into the Orthodox perspective and also to introduce to us interpretation of human rights in a theological perspective in that regard. We now move quickly to the last speaker, and after having heard now 6 speakers more or less from an inside church or theological perspective. We come to a speaker who is close to church, but who is outside, with an outside perspective as professor of human rights and human rights policy at the Friedrich Alexander University of Erlangen-Nuremberg, Professor Heiner Bielefeld. He has served as UN Special Rapporteur on freedom on religion and belief between 2010 and 2016. He had been before the director of the German Institute for Human Rights, and he is member of the working group on human rights and cultural traditions at the German Commission of Justice and Peace. Heiner, you are professor of human rights or for human rights. You have worked with the human rights system as special rapporteur and as a director of this institute. Why are human rights inalienable and universal and not only individualistic or Western? You have heard a lot of the debates from different regional perspectives, and why it is important that churches globally, from ethical perspective, back the international law system on human rights.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jochen, for those questions, which I'm supposed to answer in 5 minutes. I will try my best. I think it will work out, because my main message is human rights are easy. They are basically easy because they are basic. There's something very elementary with human rights. So they are certainly no less a matter of the heart than a matter of the mind. Now, coming from academia myself, working at a university, I would always insist that you don't need an academic degree to be able to make sense of human rights. I mean, if the understanding of human rights were to depend on academic certificates, we could forget the whole idea. Yeah, it's basic, it's easy. And I mean, what is universalism? I mean, in a nutshell, it means all human beings should be respected in their dignity. That's all. Or to quote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in its almost poetic language, recognition of the inherent dignity of all members of the human family. I mean, that is a quote from the first sentence of the preamble of the first ever international human rights document. The inherent dignity of all members of the human family. Family, by the way, human family, there is a relational concept in the very first sentence of human rights, a relational concept. So it's easy. At the same time, we know it's not so easy. I mean, like all the important things in human life, yeah, they are easy and at the same time also difficult. Now, when it comes to universalism, the aspiration is clear, but we know spelling out the claims implies, okay, you have to have a voice, you have to have media access, you have to speak certain languages. And there, of course, we face the reality of discrimination. I mean, some voices are privileged, other voices are marginalized, maybe some voices are totally absent. So in that sense, universalism is not just a reality. Yeah, so I think the validity claims are there, but there's a lot of work to be done. It's somewhat ahead of us, or universal human rights in that sense are work in progress. And ultimately, the legitimacy of human rights, of universal human rights, is a legitimacy on probation, not to be taken for granted. Okay, there are more difficulties. As we know, the human rights system is currently under attack. And you, Jochen, in your question also mentioned one element. So the simplistic equation of rights with individualism. I think, I mean, there's a grain of truth in that every human being should enjoy their rights. That's true. But I mean, the essence of these rights is always out of the box, out of isolation, get together with others. I would say all human rights, each and every human right can only make sense as a relational right. Just one example, I mean, for me, the obvious one is freedom of assembly. freedom of assembly. Of course, every human being should decide, will I join this demonstration? Will I not join it? Yeah. So in that sense, it's a right held by individuals, but it means getting together with others. I mean, I was so impressed by seeing the pictures of demonstrations in Hong Kong, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people peacefully demonstrating. I mean, what a manifestation of human rights. Yeah, it's not happening any longer. Likewise in Minsk. Yeah, I was so impressed and encouraged. It's not happening any longer. But we should also mention demonstrations, Black Lives Matter demonstrations in Washington, Berlin, and elsewhere. Yeah, so it's out of the box, out of isolation, getting into meaningful relationships, having the freedom, the possibility to do so. That is human rights. Freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of expression, which facilitates a discourse community, the various social economic rights, not least freedom of religion or belief. I mean, it's so strongly communal. Yeah, I mean, it's so obvious. Still, we have that language of individualism. I would actually claim there is maybe more Ubuntu in human rights than we generally admit, but not knowing the concept of Ubuntu sufficiently, I would actually flag that for further discussion. So the churches, I think they can do a lot. And 4 points in less than 1 minute, yeah? Reporting, teaching, clarifying, encouraging. Reporting because they're close to the people. Teaching because they speak the language of the people. Clarifying because there's so much confusion in the world, including around human rights issues. So much confusion. Encouraging because we need encouragement, reasons for hope, evidence-based hope in the area of in the face of increasing fatalism, resignation. So I mean, there's a lot to do. It's difficult, challenging, but we should never forget the simple aspects of human rights. The easy parts of human rights are the most important ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Heiner Bielefeld, really in 5 minutes to give us these recommendations, especially towards the churches at the end on the teaching and on the encouragement and the 2 other aspects of clarifying. Now, I immediately, looking at the time, move over to Ivars, and please, Ivars, could you share with us responses which might have come in and questions?
Yes, thank you. So first, just to let us know that we have participants following the discussions from Hong Kong, Nigeria, Myanmar, Tanzania, Rwanda. And we also have several questions which we can try to respond to quickly. And first of the questions, why human dignity and human rights are important to Christianity?
Now the question is, who is going to answer this question? I look into the round. I also please, from the 2, Dr. Matthews, Shunakara and Dr. Kazarian, also come in and just raise your hands. I would look at you, Dr. Tata, as a theologian, please.
The question is, why is human rights important for Christians? For Christianity. Yeah, Christianity is made up of people. So I think that is the starting point. And these people are valued before God. And they are not only valued for life beyond the present existence, but they are valued so that they can live in this life in an orderly, in a way that gives them opportunity for growth, for shared life, for peace, for shared well-being. In this regard, the rights allow them to enjoy this kind of life as a people of God. We know we can draw from scriptures where it spells out clearly what is the son of man or the daughter of man, that you have loved him this much, you have made him a little lower than angels, and creating him with honor and dignity. God is said to have created human beings with dignity, which cannot be taken away by anyone. It's something inherent in human beings. It's something that is God-given. And for this reason, Christianity upholds this value and dignity of people. We read in Genesis 1, of course, 27, that God created them and he created them in God's image. And if they have traces, if they have a DNA of divinity inside them, which means that they are highly valued, and this must be protected. So I think human rights are almost at the center of Christian anthropology. What it means to be human before God and to be human before one another is at the heart of this discussion on human rights. That's why I think this is very, very important for Christians and for Christianity.
Thank you, Kenneth. And I'm sure that in the entire round before, also relevant issues were put on the table, why it is important and relevant. And therefore, I would give back to you for the second question now. Please, Ivas.
Thanks. Yes, next question. Can we understand human rights as a part of ecumenism? And also, how can we understand ecumenism in the light of current military coup in Myanmar and Russia's invasion in Ukraine?
Maybe since Natalia addressed this issue, I would maybe ask you first to give a short response to that question.
Yeah, I just want to the first part, I want to quote Fidas, Professor Fidas, who in the pan-Orthodox process, he said that human rights are essential element of Christian anthropology. And I think it's not only an element of ecumenism, it belongs to Christian anthropology, to how we understand also human being, human person in Christianity. So that's, I think, the first part of the question. And second part, I cannot very much comment on a military coup in Myanmar. However, on Russian invasion in Ukraine, I can speak that I think that the response to Russian invasion in Ukraine started not in 2022. It started in 2014. And ecumenical response to this invasion was quite weak. And in general, Christian response to this invasion was quite weak. And many years later, it's just escalation of already existing invasion. And that's why I think prevention, the issue of prevention of violations of human rights is also very important, because it's always easier to prevent violation, to see in the very beginning when some force starts this tyrannic rule, then the deal with great results, effects of this violation. So I think that's very important for us to be to have clear mind and clear eyes to see and to react in the very beginning of certain violations, and then it will be much easier to prevent them from escalation.
Maybe I also give this question to you, Peter. You are responsible in a global ecumenical communion of churches, and you might also say with regard to this question, where are the maybe sometimes limitations, but where are also the potentials in the work addressing even controversial issues on human rights?
Thanks, Jochen. To the first part of the question, I think I could do no better than the comments, the observations made by Reverend Professor Dr. Johan Sauker, the Acting General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, in his welcome remarks. He noted that historically and substantively, that the fact that the WCC and the UDHR have the same birth year is no accident, but is driven, at least in part, by the same responses, the same impulses that came as a reaction to the terrible events of the Second World War. A common search for unity, for peace, and for justice. So I think it is part of the DNA of the ecumenical movement, even if we know the ecumenical movement has a deeper calling that they may all be one. But on these issues of very difficult and contentious situations, such as those that we've mentioned that are occurring around the world today, I mean, I think the function of the ecumenical movement and of the WCC in particular is to provide a platform for dialogue, for exchange, for sharing differences, for discussing them, and hopefully finding a common ground, finding an ecumenical consensus. So I think that's what the WCC tries to do when it finds situations where it has constituency on different sides of a particular issue or a particular crisis, as of course is now the case in the situation in Ukraine, to provide a platform for dialogue and for discussion. The WCC, of course, cannot legislate for its members or force a consensus, but it can at least try to promote one.
Thanks, Peter. And I move to the last question. Ivas, you put it also there. Will you just mention it?
Sure. And another question from our audience is how to stand up for human rights when our dignity is not appreciated, and also how to appreciate the dignity of people who are not respecting the rights of others.
I maybe not fully grasp the question, but I understand it in a way what we discussed yesterday, the victim's perspective. How do we see from a victim's perspective where our dignity is denied, and then we might even see others who use the word human rights or human dignity. But I just put it here on the floor. Please, Heiner.
To at least respond to a part of that question, maybe to the second part, I would say dignity has nothing to do with the self-glorification of humankind. It's not a romanticized concept that humans are perfect. Actually, human beings can be pretty brutal, and still they are responsible for what they do. Human dignity is linked to responsibility, responsible agency. So when, for instance, when dealing with war crimes, and that is a very topical issue, as we all know, and always has been a topical issue, by the way, still we would hold those to account to commit war crimes, wishing that they would respond maybe in the International Criminal Tribunal, but then as culprits in a tribunal, they would, of course, be respected in their rights to fair trial, in their rights to a legal counsel, in their right to have a voice. So we would treat them as responsible beings. That is dignity. It's not a romanticized concept. It's not the idealized human, but it has to do with that agency. And sometimes in extreme cases, it may be even impossible for me to see dignity in a particular human face. It's simply impossible for me to see dignity in the face of a war criminal. But then we owe it to ourselves to still treat that person as a human being. We owe it to ourselves not to let them off the hook.
Thank you so far. I would like to raise a last question, but a question with the expectation, give one sentence back from every speaker. What is your expectation? What is your hope? What will come out of this conference and out of this process? I start from there, move to there.
I like the name of the conference is Perspective. So it's not retrospective, it's a perspective, Christian perspective on human rights. And I think we have to move further. We need to develop and we need to bear fruits.
One word, encouragement.
Now I leave out Peter in order to give him the last word as responsible from the World Council. Ute.
I would only add inclusivity.
And Kenneth.
Yes, I think what I would emphasize is that we have started an important conversation, and that this conversation must not stop.
And Matthews, can you hear me? Are you there, please?
Well, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I do hope that the substantial inputs shared in this consultation will be echoed in different way, and a more systematic approach will be introduced during the assembly or after the assembly, when the new program structure and the program priorities will be evolved by WCC.
Thanks, Matthews, and Nicolas Kazarian, please.
Yes, so I really think the one of the essence, the takeaway we're gonna receive from this conference is the sense of solidarity that is at the essence of the intersection between human rights and ecumenical dialogue and movement.
Thanks very much. Now I move to the last speaker, Peter, and you might also have a sentence in addition on the process we envisage.
Thanks very much, Jochen. I guess in short, my hope for this conference and the process that has led up to it, and will go beyond it, is that this will enable us to actually recognize and engage with the differences within the ecumenical movement, the differences of approach, to really discuss them and to find a more secure common consensus upon which basis we can proceed. A differentiated consensus, maybe, taking into account the important variations and interpretations between the different denominational and regional groups. I certainly hope that this outcome will not only impact the World Council of Churches Assembly or its programmatic work, but will also be of use to the churches in their own contexts and in their own work, that it will help them to reflect upon the relationship with human rights, the relevance of these principles, and the utility of the processes that relate to them for the benefit and for the promotion of human dignity, especially for those whose dignity is imperiled. Beyond this conference, we will be taking a message to the Assembly, to a part of the process called an ecumenical conversation, where we will be able to discuss these outcomes and other inputs over a 4-day period to develop further the insights and the reflections that we've had here. But beyond that, as I said, the more important thing is how those discussions and their outcomes are received and digested by the churches around the world, the member churches of the World Council of Churches certainly, but hopefully beyond that. And I think it will be our common objective to try and promote that reflection.
Thank you, Peter, also for this outlook. And I would like to thank all the speakers here on the panel. I would like to thank the participants of this conference who contributed with their wisdom in various ways to this discussion. And I would like to thank the audience, which had to be in this hybrid and YouTube form very patient, not to be no more engaged in the discussion, but I hope that this discussion will continue and that even in communication with WCC, media communication, further voices might be gathered and maybe even brought to the ecumenical conversations we look forward in Karlsruhe. Yeah, human rights as universal rights, human dignity as dignity for all without discrimination. I think that's the message from this conference. And with this, I say goodbye to all who have followed us on the screens, and we will close this debate.